Good morning, everybody, and welcome to B'Yachad Together, spirited by American Jewish University. My name is Deb Engel-Collin, and I am the Relationship Manager for the Miller Introduction Program here at American Jewish University. It is my pleasure to welcome you here this morning to our B'Yachad platform. This platform was created by American Jewish University as our response to the pandemic and a way to bring different types of learning experiences to our audiences. Today, we are going to be having a fascinating conversation, which I will let our own Professor Robbie Totten explain in a moment. But again, you are with AJU B'Yachad, and we are this morning going to have a conversation with Robbie Totten, our Chief Academic Officer and Associate Professor of Politics and Global Studies here at American Jewish University. Previously to that, he was a visiting International Relations Assistant Professor at UCSD, my alma mater, and Political Science Lecturer at UCLA. He writes on national security, foreign relations, U.S. immigration policy, and the American founding. And his over 10 academic publications have appeared in journals such as the Georgetown Immigration Law Journal, Diplomatic History, and Defense and Security Analysis. He feels privileged to have coached AJU's undergraduate Model United Nations team. Together with him this morning, we are pleased to welcome Professor David FitzGerald, who is the Theodore E. Gildred Chair in U.S.-Mexican Relations, Professor of Sociology and co-director of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at the University of California, San Diego. His research analyzes policies regulating migration and refugees in countries of origin, transit, and destination. Professor FitzGerald's books include Refuge Beyond Reach, How Rich Democracies Repel Asylum Seekers, Culling the Masses, the Democratic Origins of Racist Immigration Policies in America, and he has won several awards, including the American Sociological Association's Distinguished Scholarly Book Award. So I'm feeling very small in my, with these two great scholars that we're going to be having in conversation today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you two, and I'm looking forward to a morning of learning.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you for that really nice introduction. And good morning to everyone in our audience who's joining us today. Professor FitzGerald and me are really excited to have the opportunity to discuss immigration with you. Our session today is going to be about 45 minutes. I'm going to take 4 or 5 minutes. I'm going to take 4 or 5 minutes to introduce our topic a little more broadly. And then I'm going to have a conversation with David for about 20 minutes or so to pick his brain on the immigration challenges today. We will then, for 15 minutes or so, answer questions from you, our audience. So please put them in the Q&A function you'll see on your screen. So the title of our talk today is A Crisis Within a Crisis, Immigration During a Pandemic. And what I want to introduce first is what we're calling the larger crisis, or the larger challenges of immigration in the 21st century, absent what's going on currently. And one reason for this frame of immigration challenges in the world in the 21st century is there has been what can be considered an explosion of migration in the 21st century. A few statistics will help to paint the picture. The United Nations reports that by 2019, throughout the globe, there were 272 million people who could be considered international immigrants. And these numbers only constitute immigrants. There were also, by 2019, over 20 million refugees and 3.5 million asylum seekers in the world. Furthermore, there was another 28 million people who were displaced in their own countries in just 2018 because of conflict, war, and natural disasters. And as a final statistic, consider that there have been over 90,000 cases of human trafficking identified since 2002, more than 30,000 recorded immigrant deaths and disappearances in the most recent 5 years. It should not be surprising then, in one sense, that the growing movement of immigrants and refugees across national boundaries in search of jobs and higher standards of living as well as away from persecution and war and violence, has created challenges and crisis within our countries. Immigration has political, economic, social, and security implications not only for immigrants, but also for the sending and receiving countries of them. There are also often vast moral and ethical public policy issues for countries regarding immigration and refugee populations, perhaps especially for rich countries such as the United States that arguably have the resources to help. And immigration has helped transform many countries into multiracial and multi-ethnic societies. And while this is often and should be celebrated and allows for these countries to enjoy and prosper from the rich experiences and skills of people from a vast variety of backgrounds, it has also been attributed to be a cause of rising levels of nationalism, xenophobia, and hate crimes. Immigration has truly become a defining and hot-button issue of the 21st century. And this is perhaps especially the case for the United States. The volume of immigration to the US has been rapidly increasing, with approximately 1 million immigrants coming to America per year since 2000, and more than 11 million undocumented immigrants currently residing in the country. There are about 44 million immigrants in the United States today. Prominent commentators have predicted since the 1990s that immigration will pose one of the greatest political, social, and security challenges of this century for America. Some observers thought that the 9/11 terrorist attack provided a harbinger of the danger that they envisaged, because the terrorists legally entered the country on temporary US visas. And partly in response to this pivotal event, Congress nearly overhauled, but ultimately failed in doing so, the American immigration system in 2006 and 7, and again in 2013. As a result, the US immigration system remains built on a foundation erected decades ago. And while Democrats and Republicans cannot in general agree on much in regard to how to proceed in this policy realm, they do agree that the current immigration system requires fixing. Major public demonstrations have ensued over immigration reform throughout the US in recent decades, including a 2005 march of over 500,000 people in Los Angeles. Perhaps some of you in our audience today participated in it. In states, localities, and cities lacking strong federal guidance have passed hundreds of laws and regulations to confront the challenges of immigration. Some of these have been focused on immigrant safety, while other of these have been concerned about their state's own safety. And these types of immigration issues are perhaps nowhere more important than here in Los Angeles, where one of AJU's campuses is located, since the city arguably serves as the epicenter of the US immigrant community. You'll notice in my introduction that I painted a picture of worldwide and American immigration challenges without mentioning the European migration crisis, the Trump administration's policies, including the oft-mentioned wall, many refugee issues in the world today, and perhaps most notably, I did not mention the pandemic. The purpose was to present a larger picture of immigrations and challenges of the 21st century absent recent events. I will now turn to Professor FitzGerald to help us unpack the challenges of the moment, including the pandemic. But before we get into the heart of our topic today, David, I thought this would be a good time to perhaps introduce you a little more to our audience. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got interested in immigration, what you studied?
Sure. Thanks, Robbie. Thanks, Deb, and good morning, everyone. I've been interested in immigration since I was a child through my own biography, but at a professional level, it was really when I was working as a photojournalist. I attended the University of Texas at Austin as a student photojournalist, and as part of that time in my life, I covered the civil wars in Central America, went to El Salvador at the end of the Civil War, Guatemala also, and was really interested to see the conditions there that were producing people fleeing violence, and then finding them in Austin, where I was going to school. And so I also started covering stories about refugees from Central America arriving in Austin. So from the beginning of my career, I've been interested in seeing these processes at the point of origin, transit, and destination. Then I came out to California to work at the Los Angeles Times in the mid-1990s. This was when Prop 187 was on the ballot in '94. And I was working out of the Orange County office, which was the center of Prop 187 activity. And I was really struck by the mismatch between the way that immigration to California, particularly Mexican immigration to California, was presented, and the reality that I saw covering those communities and those populations at the Los Angeles Times. So I decided to switch careers and go into the academy. I began working on cross-border connections between people from Mexico living in Southern California and the way they maintain ties with their places of origin. Then I worked on how the Mexican government and the Catholic Church in Mexico for the last century have managed out-migration from Mexico. Then I started working at a slightly broader scale on immigration policies throughout the Western Hemisphere. And then I've zoomed out even more. I just finished a book about how countries in the global north, that is the rich countries, the rich democracies like Canada and the European Union, the US, and so on, manage access to asylum. So it's been a process of starting out very micro and then zooming out to see some of the broader processes.
Well, it's really interesting to hear a little more about your journey as you become a scholar of immigration. Let me ask you, why go from being a reporter of immigration and more kind of on the kind of ground floor to an academic? Could you describe a little bit of that journey and how that works?
Yeah, well, I'm a huge fan of journalism. I saw on social media the other day someone saying, first they came for the journalists, and then we don't know what happened after that. So I'm a big believer in the free press and having people on the ground as watchdogs, the kind of fourth estate model of journalism. And so I enjoyed those experiences. I enjoyed getting to know people from many different walks of life. As I said, the most virulent anti-immigration activists, immigrants themselves, everyone in between. But I wanted to reach a smaller audience with deeper information. And there's basically a trade-off. You can't have it all. If you can have a very large audience, say on television, of millions of people, but the level of information is typically quite thin. You can be an academic in the ivory tower who writes journal articles that are read by 5 people. And so maybe the quality of the information is very intense. It's engaged by very few people. So I've moved towards that more in-depth work, but I've also tried to have my cake and eat it too. And I enjoy public events like this one, because I think that as academics, we do have a responsibility to engage audiences and beyond our immediate peers.
Can you tell us, on that vein, can you tell us a little bit about the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies that you co-direct at UCSD?
Sure. So we're an organized research unit. We don't teach classes. We are a hub for research about all aspects of international migration. And what really makes us stand out from other similar centers around the US is that we have a real comparative approach. We take seriously the experiences of other countries. A lot of us do work on the US. Many of us work on the US as well as other countries. So we have different kinds of research projects. I co-direct the center with Claire Adida, a French-American scholar who works on migration in France and in the US and in Francophone West Africa. We have a long-standing interest in Mexican migration to the US. Every year we send a team of researchers to Mexico to look at different aspects of Mexico-US migration. But our faculty really are working on a great number of topics. We're about to publish in January, Immigrant California. It's a compendium of chapters that look at different aspects of immigration to California. If California were its own country, it would be the world's 5th largest country of immigration. There are more immigrants in California than there are in the UK or in Canada or Australia. So that's the kind of work that we do. A lot of it really does have a policy and public outreach aspect to it.
Very interesting. Thanks. David, I'm thinking before we dive into the heart of our topic today, that it might be helpful for our audience if we take a moment to go over a little more about what we mean by immigration. What am I getting at by this? I often notice, David, in my everyday conversations about immigration, that it's one of these words and topics that everyone recognizes immediately, but often the idea or reference that a person has regarding immigration may be entirely different from person to person. for example, in recent days, I've overheard conversations in our media with folks who are really concerned about the border security and what's going on in the South. And they were concerned about undocumented immigrants in the United States. And then I also heard another group of people talking about the safety and well-being of refugees from Syria. And then I heard another conversation that seemed entirely different, in which folks were talking about Trump's recent pause or suspension of H-1B visas, in which technical labor that's perhaps used in Silicon Valley is temporary on pause from abroad. Could you say a few words about how these seemingly disparate areas are all under the banner of immigration, and how at the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies do you consider what constitutes immigration? And if you could add in your remarks a little bit for our audience, what is the distinction between, for example, an immigrant, refugee, and asylum seeker?
Sure, it's actually an extremely tricky question. You know, I mentioned sort of obliquely that I've always been interested in migration. I grew up overseas, and I would spend up to 4 years at a time outside of the United States. I never thought of myself as an immigrant or an emigrant with an E. I always thought of myself, because that's how my family thought of ourselves, as expatriates, that we were a family of expats. And there are a lot of people around the world, and in particular Americans, right? There are millions of Americans who live abroad, and they probably don't usually think of themselves as immigrants to the countries where they're living. So expat has a different class quality. It suggests someone who has a professional job in their family. It suggests that you come from a rich, powerful country. There are lots of British expats, French expats, and so forth. So I bring that up because often there are people who are moving overseas, moving across borders, who don't fit the kind of stereotypical notion of an immigrant as someone arriving at LAX or arriving at Ellis Island. The stakes are quite high when we talk about the distinction, if any, among immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. So at the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies, most of us take a big tent approach to defining who is a migrant, and we consider, I'll just talk about myself, I consider refugees to be a subset of international migrants. That refugees are a subset of people who have moved across an international border, and they've done that because they're fleeing violence or persecution. Now you'll see though a lot of advocates, people who I often agree with their political positions, say, well, no, refugees are not migrants, that they're totally different. The UNHCR has often said this, that refugees are not migrants. Why is that? It's because international law and the laws of many countries, including the US, have special provisions for people who are fleeing violence and persecution, that there are special gateways for them that are not available to other kinds of internationally mobile people. So defining whether or not someone is a refugee has really important policy implications. It has really important consequences for that individual, and as to whether or not she is going to be able to say, come to the US as a refugee, or to be able to stay as an asylee. To define what we mean by refugee, it's one of these areas where there's an everyday sense, a colloquial sense of who is a refugee, as someone who's had something really bad happen in their life, that maybe you flee because of a flood, or because of a war, or climate change. It's used very loosely in a colloquial sense. There's a very specific statutory definition of refugee in international law, and that's been incorporated into US law in the 1980 Refugee Act, which is that a refugee is someone who has fled his or her country of nationality, or the place where they normally live, and cannot return because of a credible fear of being persecuted based on one of 5 different grounds. So that it has to be a specific reason why they would be persecuted, based on their race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinions, or their membership in a particular social group. That's a broader category that's often the subject of litigation. So that's a refugee by statutory definition. And then sociologists often talk about refugees as I mentioned earlier, a subset of people who are fleeing violence and persecution. In the US, when we talk about the difference between refugees and asylum seekers, we're usually talking about refugees are people who've arrived through the US Overseas Refugee Resettlement Program. The US has resettled more than, I think, 3.5 million refugees through that program and its precursors since around 1975. So those are people who were selected while they're still abroad. They're declared to be refugees and recognized as such while they are, say, in a refugee camp in Turkey or some other country, and then brought to the US. Asylum seeker is someone who arrives in the US, at the US border or within the US, and then asks for asylum. So it's the difference of the place where they're asking for that kind of protection. There's a process. If an asylum seeker is found to meet the definition, then that person becomes an asylee.
Thanks, David. That's helpful to clear up some of the kind of definitions and ways of constituting immigration and refugee and some of the issues that we grapple with in definitions for scholars. I'll also add, I often, with my kind of undergraduate students, when I have a class on immigration, they'll often come into the class thinking we're going to talk about border security, or we're going to talk about undocumented immigrants. And I always try to remind them that immigration, at least for most countries such as the US, there's really kind of four main areas. One, of course, is border security. One is regarding undocumented immigrants and perhaps a path to citizenship or some way to make their lives and experiences better. And then there's legal or authorized immigration policy, which is in the US based on family reunification. And these are the areas, and also refugee policy as well. So David, let's get now into more of the heart of our topic and our title of our presentation today. Let's talk about the challenges of immigration in the world in the 21st century. And I will want to a little later deconstruct this frame of challenge or crisis, but for now let's run with it because we often hear it in the media. What do you see as the three largest challenges of immigration in the 21st century for the world absent the pandemic, before we had a pandemic? What would be the first one for you?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I think if we zoom out and look at the big picture, if we look beyond the headlines of the moment, one of the biggest challenges is a real mismatch between the way that the public and many politicians and media outlets talk about international migration and the reality on the ground. Now, sometimes this is a matter of there being reasonably different interpretations about the effects of international migration in different areas of life. But if we look at facts, real hard facts, we see this massive mismatch. So let me give you just a few examples of that. And even to push back a little bit at your intro, Robbie, which is that, yes, it's true that there are millions of immigrants around the world. There are millions of refugees. It's a lot of people. If you are one of them, those statuses are really important to your experiences. But overall, if you look at the percentage of the world's population that's living outside of its border, it's been pretty steady since around 1960, which is the last year for which we have good statistics. So for about 60 years, it's floated in a range of around 2 to 3.5% of the world's population. So I've spent my entire career studying a real small minority situation of the vast majority of the world's population is still living in the country where they were born. When you ask in public opinion surveys all over the world, in the US and Canada and Europe and elsewhere, what percentage of the population do you think is an immigrant? People, the public will overestimate, usually by a factor of about 2, the population that is immigrant. They have the perception that there are many, many more immigrants than there actually are. And then if you ask them about particular groups, the generally despised groups, marginalized groups in society are also highly overrepresented in the public imagination about immigration. So for example, if you ask the public, what percentage of the population do you think is Muslim? And so in some countries, you'll get that wrong by a factor of 14. Similarly, people typically have a very overinflated idea of the percentage of Jews, of, depending on the country, of Blacks, of Latinos, Roma, and in particular places in Europe. Whatever the despised population is, there's a much greater fear that there are many more of them. And we also know from those surveys that people who have a hyperinflated sense of the numbers also are much more negative in their assessment of the effects of having those populations in their countries. When it comes to refugees, there's a common claim made, including by the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, that the world is facing the biggest refugee crisis in its history. And that claim is repeated by some very prominent academics whose work I otherwise respect. It's repeated in the pages of the New York Times. There are a lot of actors from different parts of the political spectrum who have an incentive to make that claim and may actually believe it. So if you are a restrictionist, if you think that there are too many refugees in your country, maybe you want to trumpet those numbers because you want to say, well, look, we can't let any in because if we do, there's an infinite number waiting to come in after them. If you are a refugee advocate, you might say, look, there are so many refugees. We need to have more funding, more research, more people working on this issue. If you are in the media, you might want to say, look at all the refugees. Therefore, this is an important story. If you're an academic like myself, you might, and I'm writing a book on refugees now, I would have an incentive to say, there are so many refugees. Everyone should read my book on this topic. Well, if we look at the number of refugees as a percentage of the world's population, it was far, far higher right after World War II. It was almost 7% of the world's population that was displaced in World War II, and not even 1% now. Vast displacements in Asia, for example, that aren't discussed. Usually the discussion about World War II refugees is all about Europe. There were many, many more people displaced by World War II in China alone than in all of Europe. Something else that we've seen is just the way that people are counted has changed over time. So internally displaced people, these are people who are displaced by a conflict, but they stay within their country. They would be considered refugees if they crossed the border, but they didn't. So they're considered internally displaced people, IDPs. The UN Refugee Agency did not begin to count them until the early 1990s. So when you look at their statistics, all of a sudden there's a huge spike. And it's not because all of a sudden there were more IDPs. It's because before they weren't counting them. It's not a nefarious story. It's very difficult to count these people. It's not, as I said, it's not anyone trying to pull the wool over the eyes of someone else. It's simply an artifact of the way that research is conducted. So anyway, I bring this up because from different parts of the political spectrum, we still see this big mismatch between the facts on the ground and the way that they are commonly perceived. And that's even without getting into the way that they're perceived on media outlets that have a long track record of deliberate misinformation.
Thanks, David. Yeah, that you dove into that right into the kind of critique of calling immigration as in crisis, or presenting it as immigration challenges, and the dangers and drawbacks of doing that. When you were talking to, I was going to have part of my intro, but I didn't want it to go on for too long because I wanted to underscore what's often seen as the immigration challenges. But what's always stuck out for me is that there's roughly 8 billion people around the globe, and the vast majority of folks are not immigrants or refugees. And in December of 2015, it's always stuck with me. There was an article in the New York Times around the holiday season when everybody's traveling. And it found that the typical American lives only 18 miles from mom, and only 20% of Americans live more than a couple hours drive from their parents. So there's definitely danger in overemphasizing the amount of immigration there's out there, and you described a lot of really excellent reasons as to why folks would want to underscore it as a challenge or in crisis. I would like to remind the audience that if you have any questions, to please put them in the Q&A. David and I would be happy to answer them and address them as they come in. David, let's go back for 1 second and focus again on the challenges. You mentioned a lot about dangers of securitizing or turning or catastrophizing immigration. What would be one of the biggest challenges that we're facing today in the world from immigration pre-pandemic? And then we'll talk a bit about the pandemic.
Well, so sticking with the theme of refugees, even though, as I said, there are many fewer refugees now than there were earlier in our global history, there's still a lot of refugees, right? There's still a lot of people who are fleeing violence and persecution, and for them, their lives are in crisis. And I think that term crisis applies to them and their personal circumstances for sure. And there are a couple of big problems there. One is that there's a problem of the distribution of refugees, of people who meet the criterion. The vast majority of the world's refugees, about 85% of the world's recognized refugees that authorities agree are refugees, they live in poor and middle-income countries, usually a neighboring country to the conflict. So they're highly concentrated, actually. Refugees are not distributed around the planet randomly. They're overwhelmingly in a handful of countries. So if you look at the Syrian refugees, for example, they're overwhelmingly in 3 countries that border Syria. They're in Jordan, they're in Lebanon, they're in Turkey. The numbers of Syrians that have come to the US for resettlement, even before the Trump administration shut that down, were really very, very few people. So there's a problem of the distribution of refugees. Basically, the rich countries like the Japans and US's and UK's of the world are paying poorer countries to bottle up those refugees there. And historically, there's been a deal in which the rich countries like the US, Canada, Australia also will resettle some refugees. And then accept asylum seekers who meet the definition. If there's asylum seekers can make it to those countries in the global north. So that deal is kind of breaking down right now. For one thing, the refugee resettlement numbers under the Trump administration have been slashed. And we know that the goal of the administration is 0. Stephen Miller, the architect of the Trump administration's immigration policy, has said very explicitly that his goal is 0 refugee resettlements. And since World War II, the US has been the leading refugee resettlement country in the world. So that's a crisis, and it's not just a crisis for those who would have come to the US, it's a crisis because in the absence of US leadership on this issue, other countries, I think over the long haul, are likely to also reduce their refugee resettlements. A lot of countries have really tiny numbers of refugee resettlements. There are about 32 countries with refugee resettlement programs. Many of them are purely symbolic. They'll resettle 100 people a year or so, something along those lines. So that distribution is a problem. And that distribution problem extends in several different directions. Another is that for those asylum seekers who have reached countries in the European Union and are asking for asylum, they typically pile up in a handful of countries on the outer rim of Europe. So they're in places like Greece and Italy. And very few of them actually want to stay in Greece and Italy. They would rather go to Germany, they would rather go to Sweden or somewhere else. But the European Union powerful countries, the most powerful countries, have designed a system in which, despite various efforts at reform, there's really very little incentive for the other states in the European Union to take their share of those people who do meet the standard and are recognized as asylees. So there is a program. It really basically does not work in any serious numbers to resettle people to, say, Portugal. And so that's why you end up having large concentrations in these, quite pitiful conditions in camps on Greek islands. Another problem that's related to distribution is legal access to asylum. So what would you do if you are a person who is living in a country where the city's being bombed, or if you're a religious minority and you're being persecuted for your beliefs, you can't get a job, your kids can't go to college, et cetera, et cetera. What can you do if you're in those situations? Well, the rich governments, the rich democracies actually, in particular, have deliberately created a system where it's almost impossible for people in that situation to legally move to ask for sanctuary. The refugee resettlement programs have never resettled even 1% of the world's refugee population over the last several decades. So the numbers who are resettled, it's this tiny minority. There's no queue, there's no line that you get in, and as your number advances, you become a resettled refugee. The vast majority of people who would want to become resettled refugees languish in camps for many, many years and will never be resettled anywhere. So there's not a serious broad path for those people. Again, we're talking about people who were recognized as refugees. There's no question that they really are refugees, that they meet those standards. So if you're an asylum seeker, what do you have to do? Well, the countries like the US and the European Union, they've made it very difficult to get a visa, for example, to travel legally. Anyone who's traveled knows that, or maybe sometimes we take this for granted, that there are certain passports that grant you access to many countries without getting a visa in advance. And there are many passports that if you carry those passports, you can access very few countries without getting a visa in advance. So the most restricted passports in the world are almost exactly the same as the countries that produce a lot of asylum seekers. So if you are from South Sudan or Somalia or Afghanistan, for example, there are very few countries, maybe 20, 25 countries that you could visit without a visa. Whereas if you have an American passport, a German passport, a Japanese passport, then you could visit somewhere in the order of 160, 180 countries without a passport. So that's just one aspect of an entire architecture that has been designed to make it impossible for people to travel legally. So what do? Well, people who have resources then will pay smugglers to travel illegally to try to reach a country and ask for asylum. Under international law, under the UN Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, which the US and most other countries have signed, if you have traveled illegally and then asked for asylum, the fact that you traveled illegally should not be held against you in those asylum proceedings. Because the framers of those treaties understood that often if people were fleeing from their government, they wouldn't be able to have travel documents. So that is built into the law, but the system has been deliberately designed to make it so that people will in practice have to break the law in most cases to be able to go to a place to ask for asylum. So there have been some policy solutions proposed to that, these so-called humanitarian corridors. For example, Italy developed a humanitarian corridor where people seeking asylum in Italy coming from Syria could get pre-screened in Lebanon. They weren't guaranteed refugee resettlement, but they were pre-screened there for security concerns, and then they were allowed to come to Italy to finish their paperwork. The US has actually had what they call in-country processing programs in a handful of countries historically, where people were allowed to apply for refugee status from the country where they lived. So the US had that program for Soviet Jews. It had that program for a while in Vietnam and in Romania. It still has that program in Cuba. But in the greater scheme of things, the Cuban one is the only one in the world that exists now in US policy. And they really are the exceptions that prove the rule in terms of what's actually happening now. But they're also interesting because they make us think about other policy alternatives that are not widely considered.
Thanks, David. We're getting some questions and we're starting to run out of time. So I did want to address our topic head on. How's the pandemic affecting immigration today?
The pandemic is interesting because it's highlighting all of these different kinds of international migration and mobility that you were talking about at the beginning of your remarks. It's not just affecting people who are going to another country to work and settle permanently. It's affecting, tourists, business people, students on exchange programs, as well as all kinds of more classically considered migrants and refugees. It's also highlighting what some people have talked about as the lottery, the birth lottery of what kind of passport you have. Regardless of what you have done as an individual, if you have this passport, you can go to these countries, and if you have the wrong kind of passport, you can't go. So, for example, Europe is about to start opening up to tourists from various countries. There's no discussion even of allowing Americans to go. If you have an American passport, it's going to take you much longer to be able to go and enjoy the tourist attractions in Europe than if you were coming from, say, New Zealand, simply because of your nationality. Why? I mean, there's a epidemiological reason there. It's because the rates of COVID are so much higher here than they are in New Zealand. But I think at a visceral level, that's changing people's experience to understand what it's like actually for most of the world, which is not to be able to move. I think the second thing that's happening, and this has more of a policy implication, is that governments that were already trying to restrict various forms of migration are using the pandemic as a pretext to do what they were already doing anyway. And that definitely characterizes the Trump administration's response, which is to use health provisions, quarantine provisions against asylum seekers, for example, to continue work that they were already doing, or now to shut down even new temporary visa arrivals of the type that you were discussing, the H-1Bs of high-tech workers in Silicon Valley, or H-2Bs, people with lower skill levels, but doing work, say welding work, or the various other programs, even shutting down new green cards for certain categories. And we can find other examples around the world also of governments, putting into a place restrictive policies that they were already trying to do, and now there is political cover to do that.
So we're getting several really good questions in the Q&A, and we are running out of time, so maybe I can kind of put two together, or a theme of some of these together. Some folks are asking in my intro, I listed a lot of statistics, how America has roughly 44 million immigrants. America has a history of being a nation of immigrants. That's a common phrase. Someone's asking if there's a limit to the number of immigrants. How does America integrate immigrants, and how does that work? And then another person, it's a bit of a different question, but somewhat related, is if Biden, our Democratic candidate, if he were to become president, or what would change?
Yeah, good question. Let's talk about the numbers and the limit. Is there a limit? I mean, the limit is whatever the policymakers put and enforce. So the fact that there are a million, we got down a little bit under Trump, but that in general over the last 20 years, there have been a million new permanent immigrants. That's a policy choice. And the percentage of the American population that is immigrant is now at the same heights as it was in the early 20th century. So the population has grown. There are a lot more people now living in the US than there were 100 years ago. 44 million people, that sounds like a lot of people to me. On the other hand, it's 14% of the population. And we've had a lot of experience of integrating a similar percentage of the population being foreign born for several decades in the late 19th, early 20th century. There are countries like Australia that are 30% immigrant. And they've been going through an economic boom, for the last, I think, about 30 years. So, is it a lot? Is it a little? At some point, it becomes a political question about preferences. But we can certainly say that historically, in the U.S. and looking at other prosperous countries, there are places that have even higher levels. There are lots of other places that have low levels. In terms of what would happen if Biden were elected, what would be different? I don't have a crystal ball. Sociologists are terrible at predicting anything important, but I suspect that if he were president, that he would more or less roll back to the status quo ante. He would more or less roll back to the situation of the Obama years. Those levels of immigration had, for many years, they had pretty strong bipartisan support. Until around 2000, there was no clear division between Republicans and Democrats on overall numbers of immigrants in the U.S. There were these, coalitions around particular issues, different coalitions around farm workers versus permanent immigrants. So the whole discussion has become much more politicized now than it was certainly 20 years ago. But I mean, I don't know what Biden would keep from the last several years. We do know historically that policies that are put into place in a time of crisis, that's framed as a time of crisis, they tend to be very sticky. And the original conditions change, the administration changes, and the policy continues. So I don't know what they would be, but I suspect that there are features of the last 3 years that would actually probably continue during a Biden administration if he were elected, which is a big if.
Thank you, David. And I see Deb.
I think, do you want to take one more question and then I'll close up?
I think we've hit the main questions. Some of them are technicals about the immigration process. Maybe we can answer them through the Q&A. But yeah, I think we're good. Thank you. And thanks, David.
Well, I want to thank the both of you so much. One of the things that I didn't say in the beginning of my introduction is that one of the purposes of this platform is to bring thoughtful conversation to the table, and that we may have we may bring up a lot of questions, we may not have the answers, and to challenge our way of thinking. And what I loved about this conversation was that, and really appreciated, is that this is a really nuanced conversation, and to just look at it one way, your examples of the press making it seem like there are more immigration numbers than before, but facts are different. It just really reminds me of the nuance of this topic and the unintended consequences of many of the decisions that are made when you were explaining the complexity of the entire issue. So thank you for bringing that to light to me, and I'm sure to the rest of our attendees on this. So Professor FitzGerald, Professor Totten, on behalf of American Jewish University, I thank you so much for being part of this Biyachad platform for American Jewish University, which is this gem in the center of Los Angeles, which when this pandemic is over, we hope you will come and visit. I would like to bring your attention to a couple of upcoming events on our Biyachad platform. While we have these intense conversations, we also like to bring cultural and a little more lightheartedness to us. So tomorrow we're going to be grilling and chilling kosher style just in time for the 4th with Holy Smokes Kosher Barbecue. And on Monday, I'll be in conversation actually with Avi Lieberman, a comic, and the topic is Land of Milk and Funny. And then we have some conversations about Israel beyond the headlines coming up, and of course, confronting the pandemic and anxiety with Dr. Gail Saltz. So we invite you to come to visit us again and again and be part of this platform. I wish everyone a beautiful day, stay safe, and stay healthy, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at American Jewish University. Thank you.
Thank you.